The Concord Ring was the largest space station ever built by any species in the known galaxy. It hung in the cold dark between three star systems, like a ring of silver, spinning slowly and catching the light of distant suns. More than 400 species kept embassies there. Thousands of diplomats and staff moved through its halls every day, speaking in dozens of languages, eating strange foods, and trying very hard not to start wars with each other. The humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for about 12 years. In that time, they had earned a reputation that confused almost everyone. The humans were, by all accounts, relentlessly and almost painfully polite. Ambassador Laura Griffin was the reason for most of that reputation. She was a woman in her early 50s, with brown hair that was starting to go gray at the edges, and a voice that could calm a room full of screaming diplomats the way a warm blanket could calm a cold child. And she had been on the Concord Ring for 6 years, and in that time she had never once raised her voice, never once insulted another delegate, and never once missed a chance to say thank you. Her aide was a young man named Kevin Holt. Kevin was 29, tall, a little too thin, and had the kind of easy smile that made people trust him within seconds of meeting him. He carried a datapad in one hand at all times and usually had something sweet in his pocket to offer to anyone who looked like they were having a bad day. The insectoid Vraxi delegates, who were known to be suspicious of everyone, had started greeting Kevin by name. This was unheard of. The Vraxi did not greet anyone by name. On a typical morning, Laura would arrive at the council chamber early, greet every delegate she passed, and take her seat at the human podium with a cup of tea and a folder of notes. Kevin would be right behind her, already sending polite messages to a dozen different embassies, confirming meetings, thanking people for yesterday's conversations, and reminding everyone that the human quarter had fresh coffee available at all hours. It was a small thing, the coffee, but it mattered more than anyone expected. The Lorathi Collective. There's a species of tall and serious beings who looked like trees made of blue crystal, had discovered that they loved human coffee. Their ambassador, a solemn figure named Dol Vithari, could often be found in the human quarter at strange hours, holding a cup with both enormous hands and looking slightly less solemn than usual. Kevin always made sure there was a fresh pot waiting. This was the human way. Small kindnesses, offered freely, remembered always. But there was another side to the human embassy, one that most species never saw. Commander Nick Garza was the military attaché assigned to the human delegation. He was 43 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire adult life training for something he hoped would never happen, and had a voice so quiet that people often had to lean in to hear him. He said please and thank you just like Laura. He smiled at the staff in the hallways. He brought his own cookies to meetings. But behind the sealed door of his office, Garza was a different kind of calm. He read intelligence reports the way a surgeon reads a scan, looking for the thing that did not belong, the shadow that should not be there. His team of 6 worked in near silence, tracking fleet movements, monitoring communications, and maintaining a set of contingency plans that covered everything from a minor diplomatic incident to a full-scale galactic war. The plans were detailed. They were updated weekly. And they had been in place since the day humanity first set foot on the Concord Ring. Nobody outside the human embassy knew about any of this, and that was exactly how Garza wanted it. On this particular day, the council was holding a general session to discuss a new proposal. The Valith Dominion, a powerful empire of reptilian beings who had conquered or intimidated their way across a significant portion of the galaxy, had put forward what they called a protective integration charter. The idea was simple on the surface. Larger, more powerful species would be allowed to absorb the territories of smaller, weaker ones, supposedly for the smaller species' own protection. Everyone in the chamber knew what this really meant. It was conquest, wearing a legal mask. The Valith ambassador was a massive figure named Torvan. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark green scales, and had a voice like grinding stone. He presented the charter with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. He talked about stability. He talked about order. He talked about the dangers that small, unprotected civilizations faced in a hostile galaxy. He did not mention that the Valith were the ones making the galaxy hostile in the first place. When Torvan finished, Laura Griffin stood. The chamber went quiet. Not because anyone expected fireworks, humans did not do fireworks. But because there was something about the way Laura spoke that made people want to listen. She thanked Torvan for his presentation. She acknowledged the very real dangers that smaller species faced. She quoted 3 separate articles of interstellar law that the charter would violate. She referenced historical examples of protective arrangements that had turned into permanent occupations. She did all of this in a tone so warm and respectful that it almost felt like she was giving Torvan a compliment. Then she said, very simply, that humanity could not support this charter, and she encouraged the Council to consider the long-term consequences of allowing powerful nations to absorb weaker ones without meaningful consent. The motion was tabled, not defeated, just pushed to a later date. It was the best Laura could do for now. After the session, Torvan found Laura in one of the station's long corridors. He was alone, which was unusual. He stepped close enough that his shadow fell over her completely, and looked down at her with eyes like yellow glass. "Your people are soft, Ambassador," he said. "You talk and smile and bring your little treats, and you think this makes you strong. But the galaxy does not run on kindness. It runs on power. And when the time comes, your softness will be the end of you." Laura looked up at him. "I for sharing your thoughts, Ambassador. I for sharing your thoughts, Ambassador. I hope you have a pleasant evening." Torvan stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away. He would later tell his advisors that the encounter had disturbed him, though he could not explain exactly why. There was something behind that smile, he said, something that did not match the softness of her words. So 6,000 light-years away, in a facility buried deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, a woman named Colonel Dana Price sat at a steel desk and read a coded message from the Concord ring. It was short. She read it twice, then looked up at her staff. "Move us to Readiness Level 2, she said. Nobody panicked. No alarms went off. No lights changed color. The people in the room simply began working a little faster, typing a little harder, and speaking in shorter sentences. "I brought a fresh pot of coffee to the Concord ring, brought a fresh pot of coffee to the Lorathi embassy, and asked Ambassador Dolvathari how his evening was going. The old crystal being looked at Kevin with something close to affection and said it was going well. The galaxy was quiet. The humans were smiling, and deep beneath a mountain on a small blue planet, something was waking up. 3 months passed, and the conquered ring did not get quieter. It got worse. The Valith Dominion had not forgotten about their protective integration charter. Torvan and his delegation had spent those 3 months doing what they did best. They made threats in private rooms. They offered deals that sounded generous until you read the small text. They reminded smaller species, in very calm voices, what had happened to civilizations that had refused Valith friendship in the past. It worked. One by one, the colonies, the Gan, an ancient and proud colonies. The Gan, an ancient and proud civilization of only 2 billion, accepted Valith protection after their ambassador was visited by a Valith general who simply sat in his office for an hour and said nothing. The silence, the Gan ambassador later admitted, had been more frightening than any spoken threat. So Laura Griffin watched all of this happen and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt angry. She did not show it. She never showed it. She continued to smile, continued to greet every delegate with warmth, continued to send Kevin to deliver small gifts and kind words to nervous embassies. But behind the closed doors of the human quarter, she worked with a focus that made even Commander Garza uneasy. Laura was building a coalition. She spent her mornings meeting with moderate species who were uncomfortable with the Valith's growing power, but too afraid to say so publicly. She spent her afternoons drafting legal arguments, trade proposals, and mutual aid agreements designed to give smaller species the confidence to stand together. She spent her evenings on encrypted calls with Earth, asking for guidance, resources, and time. Kevin Holt barely slept. He was the one who made it all run. He scheduled the secret meetings and delivered the sensitive messages and kept track of which species were leaning which way. He wrote thank you notes by hand because Laura believed that a handwritten note meant more than a digital one. He remembered the names of every delegate's children, their favorite foods, their cultural holidays. He was exhausted, but he did not stop. He understood that what Laura was building was fragile, and that every small act of care was a brick in a wall that might one day need to hold. And then the news about the Tessari came, and everything changed. The Tessari were an aquatic species from a water world called Tessara Prime. They were small, gentle beings with translucent skin and large, dark eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any creature should carry. They had no military. They had never had a military. Their entire civilization was built around science, art, and the careful tending of their ocean ecosystems. They were, by any measure, one of the most peaceful species in the galaxy. They were also one of humanity's closest friends on the Council. The Tessari ambassador, a quiet and kind soul named Selen Voss, had been meeting Laura for tea every week since the day the humans arrived on the conquered ring. Laura always prepared the tea herself, using a blend she had brought from Earth that Selen had grown to love. They talked about oceans mostly. Laura had grown up near the sea, and she found that talking to Selen about water and waves and the creatures that lived beneath the surface was one of the few things that still made her feel at peace. When Selen came to the human embassy that evening, Laura knew immediately that something was wrong. Selen's skin, normally a soft blue, had gone almost white. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could not hold the cup Laura offered her. The Valith had sent a fleet to the edge of Tessari space, not a patrol, not a diplomatic escort, a full battle fleet, 68 warships positioned along the border like a wall of metal and fire, and they had sent a message. The message was simple: accept protective integration within 30 standard days, or face the consequences. The Tessari had no way to fight. They had no allies strong enough to protect them. They had come to Laura because they had nowhere else to go. Laura listened. Gently, I need you to trust me. Can you gently? I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Selen looked at her with those large, dark eyes and nodded. Laura brought the matter before the full council the next day. She presented the evidence. She showed the fleet positions, the intercepted communications, the ultimatum. She spoke with controlled passion about the rights of every species to exist without fear, to live on their own worlds without the shadow of conquest hanging over them. She called for sanctions against the Valith. She called for a joint council fleet to protect Tessari space. She called on every delegate in the chamber to remember why the council existed in the first place. Torvan watched from his seat. He did not speak. He did not need to. The numbers were not even close. Too many. The numbers were not even close. Too many species had been bought, threatened, or simply terrified into silence. The Valith had played the game perfectly, and the council had chosen to look away. Laura walked back to the human embassy in silence. Kevin walked beside her, not speaking, because he could see that she was holding herself together with nothing but willpower and habit. When they reached the embassy, Laura sat down at her desk. Her hands, Kevin noticed, were trembling. It was the first time he had ever seen that. She pressed them flat against the surface of the desk and took 3 slow breaths. Then she looked up at Commander Garza, who was already standing in the doorway. "Give me a full tactical assessment," she said. Garza laid it out. The Violith fleet was massive. Their weapons were powerful, and their crews were experienced. The Tessari had nothing, not a single warship, not a single defense platform. If the Council would not act, the Tessari would be absorbed within weeks. It would be fast and it would be final. Laura nodded. Then she opened a secure channel to Earth. Colonel Dana Price appeared on the screen within seconds, as if she had been waiting. "If we commit," Laura said, "can we hold?" There was a pause. Price looked at Laura with steady eyes and said, "We can do more than hold." Laura thanked her and closed the channel. She sat still for a moment, and Kevin could see something moving behind her eyes, a calculation, a decision, a door being opened that could never be closed again. Then she turned to Kevin and Garza and said, in the same warm and measured voice she used for everything, "Draft a formal statement. Humanity is extending its full mutual defense pact to the Tessari people. Effective immediately, no conditions." Kevin stared at her. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, "That is going to make things very complicated." Laura looked at him. There was no smile now. There was something else, something older and harder and more certain. "Yes," she said. "But some things matter more than being comfortable. The Tessari came to us because they had no one else. If we turn away from that, then everything we have done here, every cup of tea, every handwritten note, every kind word, all of it means nothing." Garza said nothing. He simply nodded and left the room to begin making calls. The statement was released within the hour. It was written in Laura's voice, polite and clear and firm. It said that humanity recognized the sovereign rights of the Tessari people. It said that any act of aggression against the Tessari would be considered an act of aggression against Earth. It said that humanity hoped, sincerely, that this matter could be resolved through dialogue. The last line said, "But we will not stand by while the innocent are consumed." Torvald read the statement in his private quarters. He read it twice. Then he began to laugh. It was a deep, rumbling sound that made his guards glance at each other nervously. He laughed for a long time. When he finally stopped, he looked at his senior advisor and said, "The humans have just signed their own death warrant." And they did it with a fountain pen and a polite smile. His advisor asked if they should adjust their plans. Torvald shook his head. "No. Let them come. It will be a useful lesson for the rest of the galaxy. Kindness is not a shield. It never has been." Far away in Tessari space, the first human warship dropped out of faster-than-light travel and took its position along the border. It was small compared to the Valith destroyers already gathered there, but it held its ground. And to his captain, "There are a lot of them." To his captain, "There are a lot of them." The captain, a calm woman named Lieutenant Commander Grace Tully, took a sip of her coffee and said, "There are. But there are going to be a lot more of us. Just give it time." The Valith Dominion did not panic. They had no reason to. They had conquered 11 species in the last century, absorbed 23 territories, and broken the will of civilizations far older and far larger than humanity. One small, polite species with a modest navy was not going to change the way the galaxy worked. That, at least, was what Torvald told the Council. He made a public statement 2 days after humanity's declaration. He stood at his podium, tall and armored in ceremonial scales, and spoke with a voice that filled the chamber like thunder. He said the Valith respected humanity's passion, but questioned their judgment. He said the Protective Integration Charter was about safety, not conquest. He said that humanity's emotional attachment to the Tessari was understandable, but misguided. He said, with something close to pity in his voice, that the humans were going to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between good intentions and real power. Half the council nodded along. A quarter of them stayed silent. The rest looked at Laura Griffin, who sat at the human podium with her hands folded and her face perfectly calm, and wondered what she was thinking. Laura was thinking about a conversation she had once had with her father, back when she was a girl growing up in a small town on the coast of Maine. He had been a fisherman, a quiet man who never raised his voice and always held the door open for strangers. One evening, a man at the local bar had mistaken his quietness for weakness and had tried to push him around. Laura's father had stood up, looked the man in the eye, and said nothing. Just looked at him. The other man had sat back down. Later, Laura had asked her father why the man had backed off. Her father had said, "Because he looked at me and realized that I was not afraid of him, and that scared him more than anything I could have said." Laura thought about that moment a lot these days. The council was in chaos. Many species were furious with humanity. The Drenni Federation accused the humans of reckless escalation. The Pellini, who had already given up their colonies to the Valith, were angry because humanity's stand made their own surrender look cowardly. Several delegations sent formal protests to the human embassy. Laura read every single one. She responded to every single one. She was gracious and understanding in each reply. She acknowledged their concerns. I understood their fear and respected their perspective. A few species began to quietly lean the other way. The Larathi ambassador, Dol Vathari, visited the human quarter and sat with Kevin Holt for a long time, drinking coffee and saying very little. When he finally spoke, he said, "My people have watched the Valith grow stronger for 200 years, and we have been afraid for all of that time. I am tired of being afraid." Kevin nodded and poured him another cup. Meanwhile, Commander Nick Garza had shifted into a mode that his staff had only seen in training exercises. He was calm, as always. He still said please and thank you. But his orders came faster now, and there was a precision to his movements that made the air in the room feel tighter. Human warships were arriving in Tassari space in a steady stream, not all at once, and not in a dramatic show of force. They came quietly, one or two at a time, slipping out of faster-than-light travel and sliding into position along the defensive line that was slowly forming across 3 star systems. The ships were not the ones the galaxy had seen at joint exercises and peacekeeping missions. Those had been older models, deliberately chosen to look capable but not threatening. The ships arriving in Tassari space now were different. They were newer. They were faster. They were covered in equipment that the Valith Intelligence Service had never seen before. On the Concord ring, Kevin Holt began to notice something strange about the human civilians on the station. There were about 300 humans living on the Concord ring, not counting the embassy staff. They were engineers, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, and cooks. They ran a bakery that was popular with a dozen different species. They taught language classes. And they organized cultural exchange events where aliens could try human music and food. They were, by every appearance, the most harmless group of people on the station. But something had changed. Kevin could not put his finger on it at first. They were still polite. They still smiled. The bakery was still open and the bread was still warm. But there was a subtle shift in the way they moved. They walked differently, with more awareness, more balance. And they seemed to know where every exit was without looking. Small groups that used to gather in the common areas now positioned themselves at specific points throughout the human quarter, points that Kevin suddenly realized gave clear sight lines to every entrance and corridor. He mentioned this to Garza. The commander looked at him for a moment, then said, "Most of our civilians here are veterans, Kevin. They volunteered for station duty. They have been ready since the day they arrived." Kevin blinked. "Ready for what?" Garza did not answer. He just looked at Kevin with those calm, hard eyes, and Kevin understood. He also began to notice things about the embassy itself. The walls, which he had always thought were made of standard station materials, turned out to be reinforced armor plating covered with a decorative surface. And the large windows in the main hall were not glass, but transparent composites that could stop a plasma bolt. The garden courtyard, which Laura loved and which everyone agreed was the prettiest spot on the station, had been designed so that every bench, every planter, and every walkway provided cover and clear firing angles in every direction. The human embassy was not an embassy. It was a fortress that had been dressed up to look like a home. And it had been this way from the very beginning. From the very first day humanity had moved in. Kevin sat with this knowledge for a while and felt something he could not quite name. It was not fear. It was more like the feeling of discovering that the kind old man who lived next door and always waved hello had been a soldier his entire life and had never mentioned it. Torvald sent his final ultimatum on a Tuesday. He delivered it personally in the full council chamber with every delegate watching, and he stood at his podium and read it aloud in his grinding voice. Humanity had 7 standard days to withdraw all military assets from Tasari space. If they refused, the Valeth Dominion would consider it an act of war and respond accordingly. He looked directly at Laura when he finished, and there was satisfaction in his yellow eyes. He expected her to negotiate. He expected her to ask for more time, to suggest a compromise, to find some polite way to back down without losing face. Yet by every delegate in the chamber. Then she read it aloud, slowly and clearly, so that every word was heard by every delegate in the chamber. Then she set the datapad down on her desk, folded her hands, and looked directly at Torvald. Her voice was the same as it had always been, warm, measured, steady. She said, "The people of Earth respectfully decline." Torvald stared at her. And the chamber was so quiet that Kevin could hear the hum of the station's air systems. "You understand what this means?" Torvald said. It was not a question. Laura nodded. "We do. We have always understood." Something passed across Torvald's face. It was not anger. It was something closer to doubt, a flicker of uncertainty that came and went so fast that only those who were watching very closely would have seen it. The Drenny ambassador, who had been studying Laura's face, later said that what frightened him was not the refusal itself. It was the total absence of bluff. Laura Griffin was not performing courage. She was simply stating a fact. The session ended in silence. No one spoke as the delegates filed out. The hallways of the conquered ring, usually buzzing with conversation and argument, were quiet enough to hear footsteps echo. That night, Garza received a secure transmission from Colonel Dana Price on Earth. He read it in his sealed office, alone. When he finished, he closed his eyes for 5 seconds. Then he opened them and began issuing orders. The message was short. It confirmed what Garza had been preparing for. The full weight of Earth's military, not the peacekeeping force, not the patrol fleet, not the token squadrons they had shown the galaxy, but the real thing was now in play. Far away at the edge of Tasari space, as a Valeth scout ship completed a routine sensor sweep and found something that made its officer freeze in his chair. The human fleet had grown, not by a little, by a lot. Ships that had not been there 12 hours ago now filled the sensor screen in neat, tight formations. The officer counted them. Then he counted them again. Then he counted them a third time, because the number could not possibly be right. He sent a message to the Valeth command fleet. It was 1 line long. The humans have been lying about the size of their navy. Possibly for years." The message reached Torvald within the hour. He read it standing in his quarters, and for the first time he did not laugh. He stood very still, and the scales along the back of his neck rose slightly, an involuntary response that his species had not needed since they were prey animals millions of years ago. It meant fear. The Valeth fleet jumped into Tasari space on a morning that had no sun, because space does not have mornings. But for the crew of the human flagship, the USS Carthage, it was 0600 hours Earth Standard Time, and Admiral Beth Lawson was drinking her first coffee of the day when the sensors lit up. She set the cup down gently, looked at the display, and said, "There they are." The Vayleth had committed everything, 112 warships, arranged in the broad crescent formation that they had used to crush every fleet they had ever faced. Need destroyers on the wings, heavy cruisers in the center, and Torvand's personal command ship at the back, a massive vessel bristling with weapons that could crack the crust of a small moon. It was an impressive sight. The Vayleth expected it to be a terrifying one. Admiral Lawson was not terrified. She was 51 years old, had served in Earth's Navy for 28 of those years, and had spent the last 2 decades doing one thing: preparing for the day when humanity would have to show the galaxy who they really were. She did not enjoy that day. She had hoped it would never come. But she was ready for it, and so was every man and woman under her command. The human fleet was arranged differently. No broad crescent, no dramatic display of numbers. They were positioned in layered clusters, spread across 3 star systems, each cluster covering a specific corridor of approach. The formation looked simple, almost casual, like a group of people standing at different points in a room. But every position had been chosen with a precision that accounted for gravitational pull, sensor angles, retreat corridors, and overlapping fields of fire. It was a formation designed by people who had studied war the way a surgeon studies the body, knowing every weakness, every pressure point, and every place where a single cut could bring the whole thing down. The Vayleth fleet moved forward. They expected the humans to pull back, to show their teeth and then retreat, the way sensible prey did when a predator charged. When the human ships held their positions, the Vayleth commander, a veteran named Karox, who had led the annexation of 3 civilizations, adjusted his plan. He ordered the first strike, a massive volley of plasma fire aimed at the center of the human line. And the shots crossed the void. They hit the human ships. And then something strange happened. Nothing. The human shields absorbed the volley with a flicker that was barely visible on the Vayleth sensors. Karox ordered a second volley, heavier this time. Same result. The human shields, held as if the most powerful weapons in the Vayleth arsenal, were nothing more than rain on a window. For exactly 4 seconds after the second volley, the human fleet did not return fire. Then Admiral Lawson sat in her command chair, watching the sensor data, and waited. Later, when she was asked about those 4 seconds, she said they were a courtesy. A final chance for the Vayleth to stop. A last moment of silence before the polite mode broke. The Vayleth did not stop. Lawson said one word: "Respond." The human fleet fired, and the universe changed. The weapons the humans used were not the ones the galaxy had seen in demonstrations and exercises. Those had been older systems, deliberately limited, designed to look competent, but not extraordinary. What hit the Vayleth fleet now was something else entirely. The beams cut through Vayleth shields as if they were not there. The first volley destroyed 14 ships, not damaged, destroyed. They came apart in flashes of light that were visible across the entire system. Karox stared at his tactical display and could not understand what he was seeing. His ships, his proven and feared warships. See, human center bent. It did not break. The human center bent. It did not break. The clusters shifted, reformed, and created overlapping kill zones that turned the Vayleth charge into a death trap. Human ships moved with a coordination that defied everything the Vayleth knew about fleet combat. They covered each other without gaps. They anticipated Vayleth maneuvers before they happened, and they fired with an accuracy that wasted nothing. On the conquered ring, 6,000 light-years away, the Council watched the battle unfold on long-range sensors. The chamber was full. Every delegate had come. Some had brought their entire staff. The holographic display in the center of the room showed the 2 fleets as clusters of tiny lights, blue for human and red for Vayleth, and everyone watched as the red lights began to disappear. Laura Griffin stood at the human podium. And she was not smiling. Her face was still, her eyes fixed on the display, and her hands were at her sides. Kevin Holt stood next to her, pale and quiet. He had never seen combat, not even on a screen, and the reality of it was hitting him in waves. Torvald stood at the Valeth podium across the chamber. He watched his fleet crumble and felt the ground beneath his certainty crack and give way. He had built his career, his reputation, his entire understanding of the galaxy on the belief that power was the only thing that mattered, and now he was watching a species that baked cookies and wrote thank-you notes tear his fleet apart with surgical precision. He turned to Laura. His voice, for the first time, was not steady. "How is this possible? You are diplomats. You are nothing." Laura looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was something that Torvald, in all his years of conquest, I had never seen directed at him before. It was pity. She said quietly, "You mistook our kindness for weakness. That is a very old mistake." In Tessari space, Admiral Lawson continued to conduct the battle like a musician leading an orchestra. Every order was precise. Every movement had a purpose. And in the middle of the destruction, something happened that made the watching galaxy sit up and take notice. Human medical ships moved into the battle zone, not after the fighting was over, but during it. They flew into the wreckage of destroyed Valeth vessels, scanning for life signs, locking onto escape pods, and pulling survivors out of the burning remains of their own ships. Human crews risked their lives to save the people who had been trying to kill them minutes earlier. The rescued Valeth soldiers were brought aboard human medical ships, treated for their injuries, given food and water, and told that they were safe. Some of them could not understand what was happening. One Valeth officer, pulled from a shattered destroyer with burns covering half his body, looked up at the human medic treating him and asked in genuine confusion, "Why are you helping me?" The medic, a young man named Sam Briggs, looked at him and said, "Because you are hurt. That is the only reason we need." On the Concord ring, several delegates began to weep. The Vraxi ambassador, a being not known for emotion of any kind, turned to his aide and whispered, "Oh, they are rescuing the people who tried to kill them. What are these creatures?" The battle lasted less than 6 hours. By the end, the Valeth fleet was broken. Not completely destroyed, because Admiral Lawson deliberately opened a corridor for retreat, but shattered as a fighting force. 61 of their 112 ships were gone or disabled. The rest were retreating in disorder. Lawson opened a communication channel. Her voice was calm and clear. She said, "Valeth fleet, I provide it." There was a long silence. There was a long silence. Then the Valeth commander, Karox, responded. His voice was rough and broken. He said, "We will withdraw." He paused, and then added, in a tone that sounded almost lost, "Thank you. For our people. The ones you saved." Lawson nodded to herself and closed the channel. On the Concord ring, something else had happened while the galaxy was watching the battle. A small Valeth strike team, 8 soldiers in combat armor, had attempted to breach the human quarter of the station. Their mission was to take the human embassy and capture Ambassador Griffin. They made it through the first door. They did not make it past the corridor beyond. The human civilians responded in under 90 seconds. The bakers, the teachers, the engineers, and the coffee makers moved with a speed and coordination that the Valeth soldiers never expected. The strike team was disarmed, restrained, and pinned to the floor before any of them could fire a second shot. Commander Garza arrived to find all 8 Valeth soldiers alive, restrained with emergency ties, and being offered water by a woman who had been making pastries 20 minutes earlier. Not a single Valeth attacker was killed. Not a single human was seriously injured. Garza looked at the scene, nodded once, and said, "Good work. Someone call medical, and keep the water coming. They look thirsty." That evening, Laura Griffin stood alone in the embassy garden. The battle was over. The station was secure. The galaxy was rewriting everything it thought it knew about humanity. And Laura stood among the flowers she had planted 6 years ago and felt the weight of every ship that had burned, every life that had ended, every choice that had led to this day. And Kevin found her there. He did not say anything at first. He just stood beside her in the quiet. Finally, Laura said, almost to herself, "I never wanted this." Kevin nodded. "I know. That is exactly why it had to be you." Laura looked at him. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and Kevin saw the exhaustion and the grief and the steel underneath it all. Then the mask came back, and she straightened her shoulders, and she said, "We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." Kevin said, "Yes, ma'am, but tonight you should rest." Laura almost smiled. "Is there still coffee?" "There is always coffee." They walked back inside together, and the garden sat empty beneath the false stars of the conquered ring, and the galaxy held its breath. The galaxy did not go back to the way it was before. It could not. Something had shifted at the foundation of how every species understood the universe, and that kind of shift does not reverse itself. The Valeth Dominion fell apart from the inside. Not all at once, but quickly enough that historians later struggled to pinpoint the exact moment the collapse began. Some said it started when Karox, the fleet commander who had retreated from Tessary space, returned home and told his officers the truth about what had happened. Others said it started when the common citizens of the Dominion learned that the humans had rescued Valeth soldiers from the wreckage of their own ships, and had treated their wounds and fed them and spoken to them with kindness, and that the Dominion's leadership had never once done the same for its own defeated warriors. Torvan was removed from his position within 2 weeks. There was no grand trial, no public spectacle. He was simply told by a council of elder generals that he had miscalculated, that his miscalculation had cost the Dominion its fleet and its reputation, and that he was no longer fit to represent their people. And he left the Concord Ring on a transport shuttle, alone, and did not look back at the station as it shrank behind him. He was replaced by a diplomat named Sarath, a younger Valeth who had spent most of her career arguing, quietly and without much support, that the Dominion's future lay in trade and partnership, rather than conquest. She had been ignored for years. Now suddenly everyone wanted to listen to her. Sarath's first act was to open negotiations with humanity. She contacted Laura Griffin directly and asked for terms. Laura invited her to the human embassy for tea. The terms humanity offered shocked the council. Every species had expected demands, territory, resources, reparations large enough to cripple the Dominion for generations. That was how galactic wars ended. The winner took everything they could carry, and the loser spent centuries trying to recover. Humanity asked for none of that. The terms were simple. The Valeth would disarm their offensive fleet and reduce it to a size appropriate for self-defense. They would formally recognize the sovereignty of the Tessari and every other species they had coerced into their protective integration program. They would release all annexed territories and allow the affected species to hold free votes on their own futures. And they would cooperate with an independent tribunal that would investigate the methods the Dominion had used to pressure smaller civilizations. That was it. No tribute. No occupied worlds. No humiliation. When the terms were read aloud in the council chamber, the Drenny ambassador stood up and asked Laura bluntly why humanity was not taking more. They had won. They had the power to reshape the galaxy in their image. Why were they holding back? Laura looked at him and said, "Because we did not fight this war to gain something. We fought it to protect someone. The Tessari are safe. The annexed species will be free. That is what we wanted. That is all we wanted." The chamber was quiet for a long time. Sarath, the new Valeth ambassador, accepted the terms without argument. She signed the agreement at the same table where Laura served tea, and when she was done, she looked at Laura and said, "Your people confuse me." Laura smiled. We get that a lot. In the weeks that followed, the political landscape of the galaxy changed faster than anyone had predicted. The coalition that Laura had spent months building in secret grew into a formal alliance of 46 species. They called it the Compact of Sovereign Voices, and its founding document, which Laura helped draft, stated that every species, regardless of size or strength, had the right to exist without fear of conquest. The Lorathi were the first to join. An ambassador Dolvathari signed the document with both of his enormous hands, and then stood in silence for a long time, looking at the words on the page. When Kevin asked him if he was all right, Dolvathari said, "I have been waiting 200 years for someone to write these words. I did not expect it to be the people who make coffee." The Tassari ambassador, Celine Voss, came to the human embassy on the day the compact was signed. She brought a gift for Laura, a sculpture made of crystal that had been grown on the ocean floor of Tassara Prime over the course of 100 years. The Tassari only gave such gifts to those they considered family. It was the highest honor their civilization could bestow. Laura held the sculpture in her hands and could not speak for several minutes. When she finally found her voice, she said, "I will keep this for the rest of my life." Selene looked at her with those large, dark eyes and said, "You gave us the rest of ours." Commander Nick Garza oversaw the withdrawal of human forces from Tessari space. He was thorough and methodical, as he was with everything. Every ship was accounted for, every piece of equipment was catalogued, every goodbye was handled with care. Before the last ship left, Garza traveled to the Tessari homeworld. He had never been to a water planet before, and the sight of it from orbit, a sphere of deep blue and green with no visible land, took his breath away. Then he attended a ceremony on a floating platform in the middle of the planet's largest ocean, where thousands of Tassari had gathered to honor the humans who had stood between them and oblivion. Garza was uncomfortable with the attention. He stood stiffly in his dress uniform while the Tassari sang in their strange, beautiful underwater voices, and he tried very hard not to show how moved he was. He did not entirely succeed. Ash with both hands and said, "Thank you." I with both hands and said, "Thank you. I will carry this with me." He did. For the rest of his career, that stone sat on his desk, wherever his desk happened to be. Kevin Holt was promoted to the position of permanent human representative on the conquered ring. Laura was returning to Earth, and she chose Kevin to take her place. He protested at first, saying he was too young, too inexperienced, too prone to eating snacks during meetings. Laura told him that those were exactly the qualities the job required. On his first day in the role, Kevin arrived at the council chamber carrying a tray of fresh cookies. He had baked them himself that morning, using a recipe his grandmother had taught him. He offered them to every delegate he passed. The Lorathi ambassador took one, bit into it slowly, and looked at Kevin for a long moment. "So, you humans are very frightening," he said. Kevin grinned. "Only when we have to be." "Cookie?" Dolvathari took a second one. So did the Vraxi delegate, who had never been seen eating human food before. So did the Drenni ambassador, who looked at the cookie as if it might contain a secret weapon, and then ate it anyway. Back on Earth, Colonel Dana Price shut down the elevated readiness at the Colorado facility. She walked through the corridors one last time, checking that everything was powered down and secured, and then sat at her steel desk and wrote her after-action report. It was detailed and precise, covering every decision, every deployment, every communication from the first day of the crisis to the last. The final line of the report read, "Polite mode re-engaged. Duration of disruption, 11 days. Recommended action, continue being kind. It is working." She filed the report, locked her office, and went home. She did not talk about the crisis again. Admiral Beth Lawson retired from the Navy 3 months after the battle. She did not make a fuss about it. She filed her paperwork, said goodbye to her crew, and moved to a small house near the ocean in a town that most people had never heard of. She took up woodworking and discovered that she had a talent for making bookshelves. A journalist found her eventually. They always do. He asked her how it felt to command the most decisive naval victory in galactic history. Lawson thought about it for a while, standing in her workshop with sawdust on her hands and the sound of the ocean coming through the open window. Then she said, "It felt like something I hope my grandchildren never have to do." The journalist asked if she had anything else to add. She said she did not. She offered him a glass of lemonade, and he accepted. And they sat on her porch and watched the waves and did not talk about war. Months later, on the Conquered Ring, a new species was being welcomed to the Galactic Council for the first time. They were called the Minari, and they were small, nervous beings with soft gray fur and wide eyes that darted around the enormous council chamber as if they expected something to jump out at them. Kevin Holt was the first to greet them. He walked up to their ambassador, a trembling creature barely 4 feet tall, and extended his hand gently. "Welcome to the Concord Ring," he said. "My name is Kevin. I am the human representative. Would you like something warm to drink? It has been a long journey." The Minari ambassador looked up at him with those wide eyes and took his hand carefully. "You are the humans? The ones we have heard stories about?" Kevin nodded. "They say you are the kindest species in the galaxy." The ambassador paused. "Oh, they also say you are the most dangerous." Kevin considered this for a moment. He thought about Laura, who had smiled at a tyrant and never blinked. He thought about Garza, who had built a fortress out of flower beds. He thought about Admiral Lawson, who had given the enemy 4 seconds of mercy and then changed the course of history. He thought about Sam Briggs, the medic, kneeling beside a burned soldier and saying that being hurt was the only reason anyone needed to help. And then he smiled and said, "We really do try to lead with the kindness. Please let me show you to your embassy. The view of the nebula from the East Corridor is beautiful this time of year." They walked together down the long, sunlit hall of the Conquered Ring. The Minari ambassador kept glancing up at Kevin as if trying to see past the smile to whatever lay beneath it. Kevin just kept walking, pointing out the sights, making small talk, and carrying a plate of cookies in case anyone they met along the way was hungry. Behind them, the council chamber hummed with the quiet sounds of a galaxy that was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the strongest thing a species could do was choose to be gentle when it had every reason not to be. And somewhere far away, on a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary star, a woman with gray hair sat in a garden and drank tea and watched the ocean. And the world was quiet. And the world was kind, and the world was ready just in case.